I will be forever the myth.
You're the king of kings,
There's always a pecking order. The little packers never mess with the big packers. So I'm a rooster, and he's a chicken, so to speak.
This episode of Bodybuilding History is brought to you by the Bodybuilding Legends Show.com website. I'm your host, John Hansen. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about the 1967 Mr. Olympia. It was the third Mr. Olympia, and after Larry Scott retired in 1966, we've got a new Mr. Olympia champion. So the 1967 Mr. Olympia again took place at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn, New York. This was the third Mr. Olympia, but it was actually the fifth show that was promoted by Bud Parker at the same location. Now, in 1963 and 64, Bud Parker had the IFBB Mr. America, Mr. Universe, but then, of course, in 1965, they started the Mr. Olympia contest. So this was now 1967. It was the third Mr. Olympia contest. So along with this event, they're going to hold the IFBB Mr. America contest and the IFBB Mr. World contest, and also the Miss Americana contest, which was like a beauty competition that they held for the last couple of years as well. So they had 2,500 people packed into the Brooklyn Academy of Music. It was a really, really big event. Everybody was anxious to see who the new Mr. Olympia was going to be, because Larry Scott had retired in 1966. So these contests were pretty funny because they always had a lot of different acts involved. It wasn't just bodybuilding competitions. They actually started off the show with Ricky Wayne, who was one of the competitors. He would go on to win Mr. World that night. He was a singer as well. So he sang a song with like a rock band. So that's how the night started off. And then Ed Jubenville, who was really famous for doing his muscle control act, he came out and performed that. Ed was a famous promoter. He promoted the show in Holyoke, Massachusetts, that was outside, and it was a really huge event. I think that was even featured in the film Pumping Iron. So Ed was famous for this muscle control act where he bounced his muscles and different stuff like that. And then they got started with the Miss Americana contest, which, like I said, was a beauty competition, kind of along the lines of the Miss America. They only had 5 competitors this year for some reason. But the winner was interesting. Her name was Christine Harris, and she was the girlfriend of Frank Zane, and she would later go on to become Christine Zane, Frank's wife. So Christine lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, and Frank at the time had moved from Pittsburgh to Tampa, Florida, and he started dating Christine, and I guess she had competed in events like this before, and she was an avid weight trainer, so she would train with Frank. So she went into the contest, and she won the Miss Americana contest that night. And then going into the Mr. America contest, they had 40 competitors, so it was a pretty big event. Rock Stonewall from Chicago won the short class. Rock had won the short class the year before in 1966. And Rock was in the Mr. World contest in 1965, and he took second place to Rick Wayne. So Rock was a very, very good competitor, real wide back, small waist. Joe Nista Jr. took second place to Rock in the short class. And Eddie Giuliani from New York, Brooklyn, New York, who would eventually move to California and be part of the Gold's Gym crew, he was in third place. Now, in the medium class, you had Frank Zane competing, and Frank took first place in the medium class. Frank had also taken first place in the medium class the year before in the Mr. America. And Zabel Kwazuski from California, the guy with the great abs, Zabel was in his 40s. I think he was 45 at this contest, and he had moved all the way up into second place. So this was a real strong showing for Zabel. And Alan Keene from Massachusetts was in third place. Now, in the tall class, Don Howarth took first place. Don was called the Duke of Deltoids because he had these really big delts. He looked really wide, small waist, really good arms. Don had taken second place the year before to Chet Yorton, who won the overall Mr. America contest. So Don came back after a year of heavy training. He looked fantastic, and he took a strong first place in the tall class. Ken McCord from California was in second, and Don Peters, who was a big IFBB competitor, he was also from California. He took third. In fact, the top 5 guys in the tall class were all from California. So the overall came down to Rock Stonewall from the short class, Frank Zane from the medium class, and Don Howarth from the tall class. And Don was the most popular competitor that night. He got a lot of applause from the audience. So he was the overall winner Frank Zane was pretty disappointed. He thought he was going to win that night, and he wanted to win because his girlfriend, Christine, had won the Miss Americana contest. So that would have been a great night for both of them. But unfortunately, Frank only won his class, and he lost the overall. In the body part awards, Rock Stonewall won Most Muscular. Now, Rock, interestingly, also won Most Muscular in the last 2 years. So Rock was a really good competitor. Rock also won Best Back. Don Howarth won Best Arms. Zabo, of course, as he always does, he wins Best Abs. Frank Zane won Best Legs. Frank always had great legs. He always usually won Best Legs in this division. And Mike Katz, a new competitor, a young Mike Katz from Connecticut. He took the Best Chest Award. Of course, Mike always was known for having a great chest. Now, before they moved on to the contest, they had a couple more guest acts. And Jack Dellinger, who was the 1949 AAU Mr. America and the 1956 NABA Mr. Universe, he's one of the few people to ever beat Bill Pearl in a competition. Jack was sort of making a comeback now, and he came out and he guest posed. He was in his early 40s, but from all the reports I read, I guess Jack was really not in shape, and the audience really did give him a lot of applause. He kind of did a posing routine that was from the 1950s, and it seemed a little out of date. So Jack had a great physique. When he competed, he was really impressive, really a thick guy with real big legs. But Jack was off a little bit on this night. After Jack Dellinger, they had a hand balancing act called David and Goliath. These guys were well known across the country. They even appeared on the Johnny Carson show. So they came out, and I guess they were pretty muscular guys, and they did a hand balancing act. They had something similar to this at the Arnold Classic years ago. So they got a lot of applause, and they tore the house down. And then after that, Chuck Sipes, who was actually a competitor in the contest, he was competing in the Mr. Olympia that night. He came out and he did a strongman act. So Chuck would wear this one-piece strongman outfit, and he came out, and the first thing he did was he took this heavy tire chain and he just pulled the thing apart. And I guess he was screaming and pulling, and it took him a couple minutes to do it. And finally, this chain just burst, and he took pieces of the chain and he was throwing it out in the audience. It was crazy. So then he took these iron spikes and he bent the iron spikes. And he took this iron bar and he was holding it in his mouth and he bent it. To show you how strong Chuck was, in this article I read, they said he bench pressed 500 pounds 5 times the day before the contest at Mid-City Gym in New York. Chuck was a very powerful bodybuilder, definitely had a lot of strength. So that had to be really impressive to see. All right, moving on with the contest, they go into the Mr. World contest next. Now, the Mr. World contest was open mostly to international competitors. There weren't too many guys from America that were competing in this event. They would compete in the Mr. America. So Rick Wayne wins the short class, and Rick was in outstanding condition. Rick had competed in 1965, and he won his class at the Mr. World. But he was much improved tonight, so this time he takes first place in the short class. Elliot Gilchrist from Grenada, who had also competed in some of these early IFBB shows. Elliot was an older competitor, but he was very muscular and great physique. So he took second place, and a competitor named Jean-Claude Lepage from Canada was in third place. In the medium class, a guy named Conrad Lafamboise from Canada was in first place, and Dennis Gauthier, also from Canada, was in second place. And Franklin Green, who was a really good competitor from Trinidad, he was in third place. And then going into the tall class, Vic Downs, who was from Canada, he was in first place. Now, Vic was interesting because he didn't even start bodybuilding until he was in his 30s. So now he was 38 years old, and he's cleaning up at the Mr. World contest in an international contest. So he takes first place. Christopher Ford from Trinidad was in second place, and Tony Carroll was in third place. Tony Carroll would go on to become a professional wrestler. He was a real big guy. So in the body part awards, Elliot Gilchrist, who, as I said, was really muscular, ripped guy, Elliot won the most muscular award. Rick Wayne won best arms. He had great arms. And Vic Downs won best chest. Rick Wayne also won best back. Jean-Claude Lepage won best abs. Vic Downs won best legs. And Rick Wayne won best poser. And I guess he got a lot of help from a guy named John Twitchell. John was the editor of Mr. America magazine, and I guess John really helped Rick with his posing. So Rick Wayne, very popular winner of the Mr. World. He wins the overall, as well as the short class, best arms, best back, and best poser. So this was one of the best shapes Rick was ever in. So he was a really strong competitor. Now, the year before, in 1966, they held the IFBB Mr. Universe along with the Mr. America, the Mr. World, and the Mr. Olympia. But in 1967, they held the Mr. Universe 1 month earlier in Montreal because I guess they had the World's Fair in Montreal that year. So Ben Weider thought it'd be great to hold the Mr. Universe at the same time that the World's Fair was going on. So Sergio Oliva, who had taken 4th place in the Mr. Olympia the year before, he made tremendous improvement in 1967, and he was a very popular winner of the Mr. Universe contest that year in Montreal. I want to read off some of the names of the bodybuilders that were in this contest because it was a really, really good show. In the short class of Mr. Universe, Rick Wayne was the winner. Rock Stonewall from Chicago was in 2nd place. And Dennis Gauthier from Canada was in 3rd place. So a lot of the same names that competed tonight were also in the Mr. Universe contest. And in the tall class, Sergio Oliva was a clear winner. Vic Downs was in 2nd place. Frank Zane was in 3rd place. And Christopher Ford was in 4th place. And then Vic Downs actually won the Most Muscular Award. I interviewed Vic a couple of years ago, and he told me that he was actually should have won that contest over Sergio, and it was some kind of political thing that he got 2nd place. But he actually thought that he was a better bodybuilder than Sergio that night. But anyway, Sergio was a very popular winner. All right, so let's get back to the Mr. Olympia event. They also had an arm wrestling championship along with everything else. So this was an official sanctioned arm wrestling contest. And they had the world champion judge right there on stage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. So then we finally go to the Mr. Olympia contest. So now they got 4 competitors competing in the Mr. Olympia that year. We've got Sergio Oliva. We've got Harold Poole coming back. Harold was 2nd in the first 2 Mr. Olympias. We've got Dave Draper making his Mr. Olympia debut. Dave had won the Mr. America in 1965, and then he won the Mr. Universe in 1966. So now he was competing in his first Mr. Olympia. And right from his Strongman Act, we've got Chuck Sipes also competing. All right, so the first guy up was Dave Draper. Dave was a very busy guy in 1967. He was doing a lot of movies. He was doing a lot of TV shows. And that year he had shot Don't Make Waves, which was the movie with Sharon Tate and Tony Curtis. And it was released in 1967. So Dave was doing a lot of appearances. He was doing a lot of stuff for Weider. And I guess all that traveling and all the other commitments he had, it just didn't allow him the time to train. And Dave was really not at his best. He wasn't as cut or as imposing as he was the year before when he won the Mr. Universe. Now, the next guy to pose was Chuck Sipes. And Chuck was much improved from last year. He was much more ripped and in condition. This guy had 20-inch arms. He had huge forearms. But he even brought up his legs that year. Chuck was in really outstanding condition. So then Sergio comes up next. Now, Sergio was a freak. Sergio had really surprised people the year before when he went into the Mr. World contest, and he won that easily. But Sergio, with his really small 28-inch waist, he had these huge arms, big thighs. The guy was really a freak before anybody knew what freaks were in bodybuilding. Well, in the last year, Sergio got even bigger. He looks like he put on 10 pounds of muscle. But what was really surprising was he was more cut. He was more ripped, especially his abdominal muscles, his intercostals. And along with that small waist, his added definition, Sergio was just really unbelievable. So the crowd they were actually shocked when Sergio came out to pose. But by the time he finished posing, they just gave him this big round of applause. They were just shocked at how great Sergio looked. Now, the last guy to pose was Harold Poole. Now, Harold, as I said, he had taken 2nd place to Larry Scott in 1965 and 1966 at the Mr. Olympia. And a lot of people thought he should have won in 1966. So he came out and he looked great, but he didn't look quite as good as he did the year before. He didn't look like he made the improvements that Chuck Sipes and Sergio Oliva had. So he was a real favorite with the audience, and people didn't really know which way it was going to go. So the judges conferred, and it was actually, they didn't know who to give it to. A lot of the judges had Harold Poole in first. Some of the judges had Sergio Oliva in first. So the judges actually asked the competitors to come backstage so they could look at them up close and do a pose down and have the guys pose for them again so they could decide who was going to win the contest. So at the end, Sergio Oliva ended up winning the contest. Harold Poole was in 2nd place. Chuck Sipes was in 3rd, and Dave Draper was a disappointing 4th. So this is kind of confusing because some of the articles I read, they said that it was really close between Harold Poole and Sergio, and then they finally gave the nod to Sergio. But in the final placings, Chuck Sipes was actually placed second, so that was kind of weird, but I read some old articles about it. Sergio did win, and Harold Poole was in third place, followed by Dave Draper in fourth place. So that was it for the Mr. Olympia for 1967. We got a brand new Mr. Olympia, Sergio Oliva. And it's also interesting to note that over in London that year in 1967, Arnold Schwarzenegger, 20 years old, wins the NABBA Mr. Universe in the amateur division. Bill Pearl, at 37 years old, wins his third Mr. Universe in the pro division. So you've got the veteran Bill Pearl winning the Mr. Universe over in London, and you've got this new guy, Arnold Schwarzenegger, 20 years old. And of course, as we all know, it would only be a matter of time before Arnold came over and competed in the Mr. Olympia to go up against Sergio Oliva. But in 1967, Arnold Schwarzenegger, 20 years old, wins the Mr. Universe, and he makes his presence known on the international stage, and Sergio Oliva wins his first Mr. Olympia. So that's the report of the 1967 Mr. Olympia, along with the 1967 IFBB Mr. America and Mr. World. I'm John Hansen. Thanks for watching another episode of Bodybuilding History. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so you can see more upcoming episodes of Bodybuilding History right here at the bodybuildinglegendshow.com. We'll see you next time. Bodybuilding Heroes and Legends Volume 1 by John Hansen is the book that celebrates the golden age of bodybuilding. This was the era in which legends such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sergio Oliva, Frank Zane, Robbie Robinson, Cal Scalak, and Mike Menser battled it out on stage for the biggest titles in bodybuilding. Read about some of the most exciting competitions that took place in the 1970s, including the Oliva-Schwarzenegger battles, Zane's first Olympia victory, and Scalak's controversial Mr. Olympia appearance, and much more. Filled with inspiring images of some of the greatest bodybuilders in the history of the sport, Bodybuilding Heroes and Legends Volume 1 is now available on Amazon.com, or email John directly at naturalolympia@gmail.com.